Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the starship Starbound and watched the stars move past them. He had been traveling through space for 5 years now, leading his crew to explore new worlds and meet new alien races. Jake was 32 years old, tall, with brown hair and steady blue eyes. His crew trusted him because he always stayed calm when things got dangerous. The ship was quiet that morning when the communication system started beeping. Lieutenant Amy Foster turned around from her station and looked worried. She had received a message that made her face go pale. Jake walked over to see what was wrong. The message was a distress call from a planet called Zephyros Prime. Jake had heard of this world before. It was the home of the Zephyrian Empire, one of the most powerful alien civilizations in the galaxy. The Zephyrians had ruled over hundreds of worlds for thousands of years. They were known for their amazing technology and their long lives. Most Zephyrians lived for over 1,000 years, but something was very wrong. The message said their entire species was dying. Jake read the message 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. The Zephyrian Princess Lyrathis was asking for help from any species that could save her people. She said it was their last hope. Jake called his senior officers to the meeting room. Dr. Lisa Hayes came first. She was the ship's doctor and scientist who studied alien life forms. Lisa was 28 years old, with red hair and green eyes. She knew more about alien biology than almost anyone in human space. Commander Tony Walsh joined them next. He was the military officer who helped plan their missions when they met dangerous situations. Tony was a big man with black hair who always thought carefully before making decisions. Jake showed them the message from Princess Lyrathis. Lisa read it and shook her head in surprise. She had studied Zephyrian medical reports before. Their species was supposed to be almost perfect. They rarely got sick and lived much longer than humans. Tony frowned as he read the part about their empire being in danger. The princess explained that a strange sickness had spread across all Zephyrian worlds. It was not killing them directly, but it was making them unable to have children. Their birth rate had dropped to almost 0 over the past 50 years. The few babies that were born often died young or grew up with serious health problems. Their scientists had tried everything they could think of, but nothing worked. Even worse, their enemies knew about their weakness. The Vorthan Collective, a group of aggressive alien races, was preparing to attack Zephyrian worlds. They wanted to take over the empire while it was weak. Princess Lyrathis said her people had maybe 10 years left before they would be too few to defend themselves. Jake made the decision to go to Zephyros Prime. The trip would take them 2 weeks using their fastest engines. During the journey, Lisa studied everything she could find about Zephyrian biology. She discovered that their species had become too similar to each other over thousands of years. All Zephyrians shared almost the same genetic patterns. This made them very stable and long-lived, but it also made them vulnerable to diseases that could affect their entire species at once. Tony spent his time learning about Zephyrian military strength. Even with their problems, they still had powerful weapons and ships, but their numbers were getting smaller every year. Young Zephyrians were not joining their military because there were so few of them left. When the Starbound reached Zephyros Prime, Jake was amazed by what he saw. The planet looked like it was made of crystal and light. Tall towers stretched up into the sky, and everything seemed to glow with a soft blue color. But as they got closer, Jake could see that many of the buildings were empty. The planet that once held billions of Zephyrians now had only a few million left. Princess Lyrathis met them at the spaceport. She was unlike any alien Jake had ever seen before. She was tall and thin, with pale blue skin that seemed to shine in the light. Her eyes were silver and looked very old, even though her face seemed young. She wore robes that changed color as she moved. When she spoke, her voice sounded like music. The princess took them to her palace, which was carved from a single massive crystal. She showed them rooms filled with empty cradles and nurseries that had not been used for decades. She explained that she had 3 daughters, who were the last fertile females of royal blood. If they could not have healthy children soon, the royal line would end forever. Then Princess Lyrathis told them why she had called for human help. She had been studying different alien species for many years, looking for a solution to her people's problem. She had watched humans survive in places where other species had failed. Humans could live on worlds that were too hot, too cold, or too dangerous for most other aliens. They could eat almost anything and adapt to any environment. Most importantly, humans had something that Zephyrians had lost long ago. Human genetics were messy and random. Every human was different from every other human in small but important ways. This randomness was exactly what the Zephyrian species needed to survive. The princess made an offer that shocked Jake and his crew. She wanted one human male to bond with her 3 daughters and father children who would be half human and half Zephyrian. These hybrid children might have the genetic diversity needed to save the Zephyrian species. In return, the Zephyrians would share all of their advanced technology with humanity. Jake felt the weight of 2 civilizations resting on his shoulders as he realized that he might be the only hope for both species. Jake Morrison spent his first night on Zephyros Prime thinking about the princess's offer. The guest room they gave him was beautiful, with walls that glowed softly and a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud, but he could not sleep. The idea of bonding with 3 alien princesses to save 2 species felt impossible to understand. The next morning, Princess Lyrathis took Jake to meet her daughters. They walked through corridors filled with floating lights and walls that showed pictures of Zephyrian history. Jake saw images of their empire when it was strong, with billions of people living on thousands of worlds. Now those same worlds were mostly empty. The first daughter they met was Princess Serendai. She was working in a laboratory that looked more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen. Machines hummed quietly, while holographic displays showed complex genetic patterns floating in the air. Serendai was the oldest daughter at 400 years old, though she looked like a human woman in her 20s. Serendai had the same pale blue skin as her mother, but her eyes were a deeper blue color. She wore a simple white robe and had her long silver hair tied back. When Jake entered her lab, she barely looked up from her work. She was studying genetic samples under a microscope that used light beams instead of lenses. Princess Lyra introduced Jake to Serendai, who finally stopped working and turned to examine him. She walked around Jake like he was another specimen for her to study. She asked him questions about human biology and seemed surprised by his answers. Humans could survive injuries that would kill most aliens. They could go without food longer than species twice their size. They could adapt to new environments in just a few generations. Serendai explained that she had been working for decades to find a cure for their genetic problems. She had tried mixing genes from different Zephyrian families, but they were all too similar. She had studied samples from other alien species, but none of them were compatible with Zephyrian biology. Humans were the first species that might actually work. The second daughter was Princess Miralyn. They found her in the military training center, practicing combat with holographic enemies. She moved like a dancer, flowing from one fighting position to another. Her weapons were made of pure energy that she could shape with her thoughts. When she finished her training, the holographic enemies disappeared. Miralyn was 300 years old and looked stronger than her sister. She had the same blue skin, but her eyes were green like emeralds. Her hair was shorter, and she wore armor that seemed to be made of living metal. When Princess Lyrathis introduced Jake, Miralyn studied him with the eyes of a warrior sizing up a potential ally or enemy. She asked Jake to show her how humans fought. Jake was not a soldier, but he had learned basic combat during his space training. He picked up a training weapon and tried to match Miralyn's movements. She was much faster and stronger than him, but she seemed surprised by his unpredictability. Humans did not follow the same fighting patterns that other species used. Miralyn explained that she commanded what was left of the Zephyrian military. They still had powerful ships and weapons, but they did not have enough people to use them. Every year, fewer young Zephyrians joined the military. Soon, they would not be able to defend even their home world. She had been studying human military tactics and found them very different from Zephyrian methods. The youngest daughter was Princess Kirabeth. They found her in the palace gardens, sitting among plants that glowed with their own light. She was 200 years old, which made her very young for his age. She had lighter blue skin than her sisters, and her eyes changed color depending on her mood. Right now they were a soft purple color. Kirabeth was different from her sisters. When Jake approached, she stood up and smiled at him. She was the first Zephyrian he had met who showed clear emotions on her face. Most Zephyrians kept their feelings hidden, but Kirabeth seemed more open and friendly. She had a special ability that other Zephyrians had lost over the generations. She could sense the emotions and thoughts of other beings. When she looked at Jake, she could feel his confusion, worry, and determination. She told him that she could sense his good heart and his desire to help both species. Kirabeth explained that emotions were considered dangerous by most Zephyrians. Their society had taught them to control their feelings and make decisions based only on logic. But she believed that emotions were important for understanding other beings and making real connections between different species. Over the next few days, Jake spent time with each princess to learn more about them and their culture. Dr. Lisa Hayes worked with Sarandai to study the biological compatibility between humans and Zephyr. They discovered that human DNA had random variations that could provide exactly what the Zephyrian gene pool needed. Commander Tony Walsh worked with Miralyn to understand the military situation. The Vorthan Collective had been watching the Zephyrian Empire for years, waiting for the right moment to attack. They had superior numbers and were not affected by the genetic problems that plagued the Zephyrians. Jake found himself drawn to all three princesses for different reasons. Sarandai was brilliant and dedicated to saving her people through science. Miralyn was brave and willing to fight against impossible odds to protect her empire. Kirabeth was kind and understood that emotions could be a source of strength rather than weakness. But Jake also noticed that the princesses had problems caused by their culture. Sarandai worked constantly and rarely slept or ate properly. She had forgotten how to enjoy life outside of her laboratory. Miralyn was so focused on military duty that she had never learned to relax or have fun. She saw everything as a potential threat to be analyzed and defeated. Kirabeth was lonely because other Zephyrians avoided her emotional openness. They thought her empathic abilities were strange and uncomfortable. She spent most of her time alone in the gardens, talking to the plants because they were the only living things that did not judge her for feeling emotions. Jake began to understand that the Zephyrian genetic crisis was connected to their emotional suppression. They had bred out the chaos and unpredictability that made life interesting and adaptable. They had become so focused on perfection that they had lost the messy vitality that kept species alive and growing. As Jake learned more about each princess, he realized that saving the Zephyrian species would require more than just genetic mixing. It would require teaching them to embrace the randomness and emotional connections that humans took for granted. The princesses would need to learn to be more human, just as Jake would need to learn to understand their alien culture. Jake Morrison had been on Zephyr's Prime for 2 weeks when he finally agreed to the bonding ceremony. The decision was not easy, but he understood that 2 entire species depended on his choice. Dr. Lisa Hayes had confirmed that human and Zephyr genetics could work together to create healthy hybrid children. Commander Tony Walsh had seen the military reports that showed the Vorthon Collective was preparing to attack within months. Princess Lyrathus was relieved when Jake accepted her proposal. She began planning a ceremony that would follow ancient Zephyrian traditions. But not everyone was happy about the decision. High Counselor Vexter, an old Zephyrian noble who had served the Empire for 800 years, strongly opposed the plan. Vexter believed that mixing Zephyrian blood with human genetics would destroy their pure heritage. He had spent his long life believing that Zephyrians were superior to all other species. The idea of a human male bonding with the royal princesses disgusted him. He secretly began gathering other nobles who shared his views. 3 days before the ceremony, Vexter made his move. He led a group of conservative Zephyrians in an attack on the palace. They used energy weapons to blast through the main doors and tried to capture Jake and the princesses. They planned to exile Jake from the planet and force the princesses to find a different solution to their genetic crisis. Jake was with Princess Kiribeth in the palace gardens when the attack began. They heard the sound of energy weapons and shouting voices echoing through the crystal corridors. Kiribeth used her empathic abilities to sense the emotions of the attackers. She could feel their anger and fear, but also their determination to stop the bonding ceremony. Princess Serendai was in her laboratory when the rebels reached her. She quickly gathered her most important research data and destroyed the rest to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. She had been working on a genetic therapy that could help all Zephyrians, not just the royal family. She could not let that information be lost. Princess Miralyn was in the military command center when she received reports of the attack. She immediately activated the palace defense systems, but many of the guards were loyal to Vexter. She realized that they could not fight their way out of the palace against their own people. Jake proved his value as a human during the escape, while the Zephyrians tried to solve their problems with careful planning and logical thinking. Jake acted on instinct. He found a maintenance tunnel that led out of the palace and convinced the princesses to follow him. Zephyrians rarely used such crude escape routes, which is why Vexter had not thought to guard them. The group made their way through the crystal mountains outside the capital city. Jake carried supplies and helped the princesses when the terrain became difficult. Zephyrians were not used to physical hardship because their technology usually made life comfortable. But Jake had grown up camping and hiking on Earth, so he knew how to survive in the wilderness. During their second day in the mountains, Princess Kiribeth was injured when she fell from a crystal ledge. Her leg was broken and she was bleeding, blue blood from several cuts. The injury would not have been serious if they had access to Zephyrian medical technology, but they were far from any hospital. Jake surprised the princesses by immediately taking charge of the medical situation. He used his basic first aid training to stop the bleeding and set Kiribeth's broken leg. He tore strips from his own clothes to make bandages. Most importantly, he stayed calm and confident, which helped reduce everyone's panic. Princess Serendai was amazed by Jake's quick thinking and practical skills. She had always believed that intelligence meant understanding complex theories and scientific principles. But Jake showed her that intelligence could also mean knowing how to solve immediate problems with whatever materials were available. Princess Miralyn was impressed by Jake's courage. When Vextar's soldiers found their hiding place, Jake did not run away. Instead, he helped create a distraction that allowed the princesses to escape deeper into the mountains. He risked his own safety to protect people he had known for only a few weeks. They finally reached the ancient temple complex deep in the Crystal Mountains. These temples had been built thousands of years ago when the Zephyrian Empire was young. Most modern Zephyrians had forgotten about them, but Princess Lyrothis had told her daughters about the sacred sites when they were children. The temples were carved from massive crystals that glowed with their own inner light. Ancient Zephyrian writing covered the walls, telling stories of their ancestors who had been more emotional and spontaneous than modern Zephyrians. The temples felt alive with old magic and forgotten wisdom. While they waited in the safety of the temples, something unexpected happened. The three princesses began to change, away from the formal restrictions of palace life and influenced by Jake's emotional openness. They started to rediscover feelings that their people had suppressed for generations. Princess Serendai laughed for the first time in decades when Jake told her a funny story about his adventures in space. The sound of her laughter echoed through the crystal chambers like music. She realized that she had been so focused on her scientific work that she had forgotten how to enjoy simple pleasures. Princess Marilyn learned to trust her instincts, instead of just following tactical procedures. When Jake suggested an unconventional way to set up their defenses, she listened to her feelings and agreed with his plan. She discovered that intuition could be just as valuable as military training. Princess Kirabeth felt less alone for the first time in her life. Jake accepted her empathic abilities as a gift rather than a weakness. He encouraged her to use her emotional insights to help the group work together better. She learned that sharing feelings could create stronger bonds between people. Dr. Lisa Hayes and Commander Tony Walsh had escaped the palace separately and made their way to the temples with a small group of loyal Zephyrian guards. They brought news that Princess Lyrathis was safe, but under house arrest. Vexstar had declared himself the temporary ruler of the empire. But they also brought good news. Many younger Zephyrians disagreed with Vexstar's actions. They understood that their species needed to change in order to survive. A growing resistance movement was forming to support the bonding ceremony and the hope it represented. The group decided to hold the bonding ceremony in the ancient temples, rather than waiting to return to the palace. The temples felt more appropriate anyway, since they represented the older, more emotional Zephyrian culture that had been lost over the centuries. Jake and the three princesses performed a ceremony that combined human and Zephyrian traditions. Instead of the cold, clinical procedure that Vexstar had expected, it became a celebration of two species, choosing to trust each other with their futures. The crystal walls of the temples seemed to glow brighter as the ceremony proceeded, as if the ancient magic approved of their choice. But even as they celebrated their union, reports came in that Vorthan collective scout ships had been seen at the edge of the Zephyrian system. The enemy was taking advantage of the civil unrest to begin their invasion. The real test of the human-Zephyrian alliance was about to begin. 8 months had passed since the bonding ceremony in the Crystal Temples. Jake Morrison now lived in a special wing of the palace with his 3 wives, as the Zephyrians called them. The civil war with Vexstar's rebels had ended when the first hybrid children were born. Even the most conservative Zephyrians could not argue with the success of the genetic mixing. The 3 babies were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Alex, the son of Princess Serendai, had inherited his mother's brilliant mind, but also had his father's curiosity and creativity. At only a few months old, he could already focus on complex patterns and seemed to understand both human and Zephyrian languages. Maya, the daughter of Princess Marilyn, showed signs of both tactical thinking and emotional intuition. She could sense when people were upset or happy, like her Aunt Kirabeth, but she also seemed to naturally understand how things worked mechanically. When she played with toys, she would take them apart and put them back together in new ways. Ben, the son of Princess Kirabeth, had the strongest empathic abilities anyone had ever recorded. He could sense emotions from much farther away than any pure Zephyrian. But unlike his mother, he did not become overwhelmed by other people's feelings. He seemed to naturally know how to help people feel better when they were sad or scared. Dr. Lisa Hayes worked with Princess Serendai to study the children's genetics. They discovered that the hybrid DNA was not just a simple mix of human and Zephyrian traits. The combination had created something entirely new. The children had the long lifespan of Zephyrians, but also the adaptability of humans. Most importantly, their genetics showed the kind of diversity that could save the entire Zephyrian species. But there was no time to fully enjoy this success. The Vorthan Collective had taken advantage of the Zephyrian civil war to build up their invasion fleet. Long-range sensors showed hundreds of enemy ships gathering at the edge of the star system. The Vorthans had been planning this attack for decades, studying Zephyrian military tactics and weaknesses. Commander Tony Walsh worked with Princess Marilyn to prepare the Empire's defenses. The Zephyrian military still had advanced technology and powerful weapons, but they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1. Traditional Zephyrian battle tactics emphasized careful planning and defensive positions against the overwhelming numbers of the Vorthan fleet. These methods would not be enough. Jake proposed a different approach. He had been studying human military history and noticed that humans often won battles against superior forces by using unexpected tactics. Human armies had succeeded throughout history by being unpredictable and adapting quickly to changing situations. The problem was that Zephyrian commanders had been trained for centuries to follow established battle plans. They were excellent at executing complex strategies, but they struggled when situations changed rapidly. Jake suggested combining Zephyrian technology with human-style tactical flexibility. Princess Mirlin was skeptical at first. She had studied warfare for 300 years and believed that discipline and planning were the keys to victory. But her bonding with Jake had taught her to trust her emotions and instincts. She decided to listen to his unconventional ideas. They began training mixed units of humans and Zephyrians. Jake's crew from the Starbound worked alongside Zephyrian soldiers to develop new fighting techniques. The humans taught the Zephyrians how to improvise and adapt when plans went wrong. The Zephyrians taught the humans how to use advanced energy weapons and defensive systems. At first, the training was difficult. Zephyrians were used to receiving detailed orders and following them precisely. Humans preferred to understand the overall goal and then figure out the best way to achieve it in the moment. The two species had to learn to work together, despite their very different approaches to problem-solving. Princess Kirabeth helped bridge the gap between the two groups. Her empathic abilities allowed her to understand the emotional needs of both humans and Zephyr. She could sense when someone was frustrated or confused and help them communicate better with their alien partners. The hybrid children, despite being only babies, seemed to naturally understand both ways of thinking. Alex would watch the tactical planning sessions with intense focus, as if he was already learning military strategy. Maya would play with toy spaceships and seemed to instinctively understand how they should move in formation. Ben would calm upset soldiers just by being near them. When the Vorthon invasion finally began, it was larger and more aggressive than anyone had expected. The enemy fleet included over 800 ships with advanced weapons designed specifically to counter Zephyrian technology. The Vorthans had spent decades preparing for this moment and were confident of victory. The first battle took place near the outer planets of the Zephyrian system. Traditional Zephyrian tactics called for meeting the enemy in a large defensive formation, but Jake convinced Princess Miralyn to try something different. Instead of one big battle, they split their forces into many small groups that could attack from unexpected directions. The Vorthan commanders had studied every major Zephyrian battle from the past 1,000 years. They knew exactly how the Empire's forces would deploy and had planned countermeasures for every traditional tactic, but they had never seen Zephyrians fight like humans. Using hit-and-run attacks and constantly changing strategies, Jake led one of the human Zephyrian mixed squadrons in a daring attack on a Vorthan supply convoy. His team used Zephyrian stealth technology to approach unseen, then switched to human-style, aggressive tactics for the actual battle. They destroyed 3 enemy ships and escaped before the Vorthons could organize a counterattack. Princess Miralyn commanded the main fleet, using a combination of careful Zephyrian planning and flexible human tactics. When the enemy tried to surround her forces, she split them into smaller groups that attacked from multiple directions. When the Vorthans adapted to counter her new tactics, she changed them again. The key to success was communication. Princess Kirabeth had developed an empathic network that allowed commanders to share not just information, but also emotions and instincts. Human intuition could be instantly shared with Zephyrian strategic thinking. Zephyrian technological knowledge could be combined with human creativity. Back on the home world, Dr. Lisa Hayes and Princess Serendai worked together to develop new technologies based on the hybrid children's unique abilities. They created communication systems that worked like Ben's empathic powers, allowing instant emotional connection across vast distances. They designed adaptive computer systems that could learn and change like Alex's developing mind. The war lasted for 6 months, but gradually the tide turned in favor of the Zephyrian Empire. The Vorthons had planned for a quick victory against a predictable enemy. They had not prepared for an opponent that could combine the best traits of two different species and constantly evolve new tactics. The final battle took place in orbit, around Zephyros Prime itself. Jake and Princess Marilyn led a combined fleet that used every lesson they had learned during the war. Human creativity and Zephyrian technology worked together in perfect harmony. The enemy fleet was defeated so completely that the surviving Vorthon ships retreated to their own territory and agreed to a peace treaty. As Jake held his 3 children and looked out at the rebuilt Zephyrian fleet, he realized that they had created something entirely new. The hybrid children represented not just the salvation of the Zephyrian species, but the birth of a new kind of civilization that could adapt and grow in ways that neither species could achieve alone. 5 years had passed since the Great War with the Vorthon Collective ended. Jake Morrison stood on the balcony of his family's quarters in the Crystal Palace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold. Below him, the capital city of Zephyros Prime buzzed with activity as humans and Zephyrians worked together to build their shared future. The transformation had been remarkable. What had started as a desperate attempt to save one dying species had become the foundation of something much greater. The Zephyrian Empire had evolved into the Terran's Alliance, a partnership that brought together the best qualities of both civilizations. Jake's 3 children had grown into extraordinary beings who embodied the success of this alliance. Alex, now 5 years old, could solve complex mathematical problems that challenged adult scientists. But unlike his Zephyrian relatives, he approached these problems with playful curiosity rather than cold logic. He would laugh with delight when he discovered a new pattern or principle. Maya had inherited her mother's warrior spirit, but combined it with human emotional intelligence. She could plan tactical exercises that impressed military commanders, then switch to comforting a crying child with equal skill. She moved through the world with confidence and compassion that made everyone around her feel safer. Ben's empathic abilities had grown stronger as he aged, but he had learned to control them in ways that pure Zephyrians never could. He could sense the emotions of entire groups of people and somehow help them find harmony together. When humans and Zephyrians disagreed about something, Ben could often bridge the gap just by being present. Dr. Lisa Hayes had become the director of the new Genetic Research Institute, where she worked with Princess Serendai to develop treatments based on the hybrid children's DNA. They had created a therapy that could restore genetic diversity to any Zephyrian who chose to receive it. Thousands of Zephyrians had volunteered for the treatment, and the results were encouraging. The treated Zephyrians did not become human, but they regained the genetic flexibility their species had lost over thousands of years. They became more adaptable, more creative, and more emotionally open. Birth rates across the empire had increased dramatically, and the new babies showed the kind of healthy genetic variation that would keep the species strong for generations to come. Princess Serendai had changed the most of the 3 sisters. Her laboratory was now filled with laughter and conversation as human and Zephyrian researchers worked together on projects that neither species could have accomplished alone. She had learned to balance her scientific work with family time and personal relationships. She still loved research, but she no longer let it consume her entire life. Commander Tony Walsh had become the chief military advisor for the Alliance fleet. He worked with Princess Marilyn to train officers from both species in the new hybrid tactics that had won the war against the Vorthons. Their military academies attracted students from dozens of other alien civilizations who wanted to learn their innovative approaches to strategy and combat. Princess Miralyn had discovered that combining human intuition with Zephyrian planning created military leaders who were both decisive and thoughtful. She had developed a new philosophy of warfare that emphasized protecting innocent people rather than just defeating enemies. The Alliance military had become a peacekeeping force that helped settle disputes between different species. Princess Kiribeth had become the Alliance's chief diplomat, traveling between star systems to negotiate treaties and resolve conflicts. Her enhanced empathic abilities, strengthened by her bond with Jake, allowed her to understand the emotional needs of many different alien species. She had prevented 3 wars through careful diplomacy and genuine understanding of all parties involved. Jake himself had been given the title of Alliance Coordinator, though he preferred to think of himself simply as a bridge between 2 worlds. He spent his time traveling between human colonies and Zephyrian worlds, helping both species adapt to their new partnership. He had learned to speak several alien languages and had become skilled at helping different cultures understand each other. The palace where they lived had been redesigned to accommodate both human and Zephyrian needs. Gardens filled with earth plants grew alongside Zephyrian crystal formations. Children of both species played together in courtyards where the architecture blended organic curves with geometric precision. The building itself had become a symbol of successful cooperation, but the changes went far beyond just the royal family. Throughout the Alliance, humans and Zephyrians were learning from each other in ways that benefited everyone. Human farmers taught Zephyrians how to grow food on worlds with difficult climates. Zephyrian engineers showed humans how to build cities that worked in harmony with their natural environments. Trade between the 2 species had created prosperity that neither could have achieved alone. Human creativity combined with technology produced innovations that amazed the entire galaxy. Their starships could travel faster and farther than anything either species had built separately. Their medical technology could heal injuries and diseases that had once been fatal. Other alien civilizations had taken notice of the Alliance's success. Delegations arrived regularly from species who wanted to learn about human-Zephyrian cooperation. Some wanted to trade with the Alliance, while others hoped to join it as junior partners. The galaxy was becoming a more peaceful place as the Alliance's example inspired other species to work together. The children had begun attending a special school where young humans and Zephyrians learned together. Alex, Maya, and Ben were not the only hybrid children anymore. Dozens of other human-Zephyrian couples had formed families, creating a new generation that thought of cooperation between species as natural and normal. Jake often watched these children play together and marveled at how easily they switched between human and Zephyrian games and customs. They spoke both languages fluently and seemed to understand instinctively that differences between people could be sources of strength rather than conflict. On this particular evening, Jake was joined on the balcony by his 3 wives and their children. Princess Lyrithus, now a grandmother, often visited to spend time with the little ones. She had lived for over 1,500 years, but she said that watching the hybrid children grow up was the most exciting experience of her long life. As they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky, Jake thought about how much had changed since that first desperate distress call from Zephyros Prime. What had seemed like an impossible situation had become the foundation for a new kind of civilization. The Alliance was now planning its first expedition to another galaxy. The Andromeda Galaxy was millions of light years away, but the combined technology and determination of humans and Zephyrians made the journey possible. Jake's oldest son Alex had already announced that he wanted to lead that expedition when he grew up. Jake smiled as he thought about the future. The royal decree that had brought him to Zephyros Prime had been intended to save one dying species. Instead, it had created something entirely new, a partnership between species that proved the galaxy was big enough for everyone to thrive together. The hybrid children represented more than just genetic success. They were living proof that differences between people could create strength rather than division. as Jake held his family close and looked up at the infinite stars. He knew that the best adventures were still waiting to be discovered.